What if I told you that Vikings brushed their teeth with urine, and that was considered good hygiene? Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something that'll make your morning routine feel like absolute luxury. Picture this. You're jolting awake in a smoky, windowless longhouse where the air tastes like burnt wood and unwashed bodies. The person next to you is coughing up something that sounds suspiciously wet, and you realize with growing horror that this isn't a nightmare. This is your new reality as a Viking raider. Through the next few minutes, you'll discover why that protein bar you skipped for breakfast would have been a feast compared to what's waiting for you. And by the end of this journey, you'll understand why modern dentistry might just be humanity's greatest achievement. The wooden floor beneath you creaks ominously as you shift, and immediately you're hit with the first brutal reality check. Everything hurts. Your back feels like someone used it as an anvil, which makes sense considering your mattress is essentially a pile of straw that's seen better decades. The scratchy wool blanket that's supposed to keep you warm has somehow managed to both overheat and underinsulate you simultaneously. A talent that only medieval textiles seem to possess. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global night owl community come together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The longhouse around you is a symphony of unpleasant sounds. Someone snoring with the intensity of a chainsaw, while another person seems to be having a heated argument with their dreams in Old Norse. The central fire pit still glows with dying embers, casting dancing shadows that make everything look vaguely threatening. You try to sit up and immediately bang your head on the low wooden beam above, because apparently, medieval architects believed that anyone taller than 5'6" was showing off. Your first instinct is to check your phone for the time, but then reality crashes down like a cold wave. There are no phones, no clocks, no way to know if it's 3 a.m. or 6 a.m. or if time even matters anymore in this pre-industrial hellscape. The only indication that morning is approaching is the gradual lightening of the smoke hole in the roof, which serves as the world's most inefficient skylight. As you fumble around in the dim light, your hand touches something that feels suspiciously like dried fish. This turns out to be accurate, because Vikings had the charming habit of hanging their food from the rafters like some kind of medieval charcuterie board. The smell is distinctive. Imagine if someone took perfectly good fish, forgot about it for several months, then decided it was ready for breakfast. The historical reality of Viking sleeping arrangements was far from the romanticized version we see in movies. Most Vikings slept communally in longhouses that could accommodate anywhere from 20 to 60 people, depending on the family's wealth and status. Privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. You slept, ate, and lived in full view of your extended family, their servants, and probably a few animals for good measure. But here's where it gets interesting. Vikings were actually quite particular about cleanliness, at least by medieval standards. They bathed regularly, usually once a week, which was practically obsessive compared to their European contemporaries. They even had a specific day for it, Saturday, which they called laugardagur, or washing day. The word laundry actually comes from this Norse tradition. Historians still argue whether Viking hygiene practices were influenced by their contact with Islamic cultures during their extensive trading expeditions, or if they developed these habits independently. What we do know is that they used a strong lye soap made from animal fat and ash, which was effective but probably felt like washing with liquid sandpaper. As you struggle to your feet, every joint in your body protests with the enthusiasm of a medieval peasant revolt. The straw beneath your feet crunches with each step, and you realize that some of it has somehow worked its way into your clothes, your hair, and places you'd rather not think about. This is going to be a long day, and it hasn't even officially started yet. The other Vikings around you are beginning to stir, and you notice something peculiar. They're all reaching for small wooden sticks. At first, you think they might be kindling for the fire, but then you watch in fascination and horror as they begin using these sticks to clean their teeth. The Vikings were actually quite advanced in dental hygiene. They used frayed twigs as toothbrushes, and yes, sometimes urine as mouthwash. The ammonia was thought to whiten teeth and kill bacteria. You stumble toward what appears to be the breakfast area and immediately wish you hadn't. The morning meal situation makes airplane food look like a Michelin-starred experience. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight of breakfast, it's the smell. Imagine if someone took oatmeal, left it out in the rain for a week, then decided to serve it anyway. That's your introduction to Viking porridge, or grotter as they called it, which sounds appropriately grim. The wooden bowl thrust into your hands contains a grayish, lumpy substance that seems to be moving slightly, though you desperately hope that's just the steam. Your fellow Vikings are attacking their bowls with the enthusiasm of people who have never heard of flavor, and you realize this is probably the highlight of their culinary day. The porridge is made from whatever grains they could get their hands on: barley, oats, rye, all boiled together with water or milk if they were feeling fancy. Sometimes they'd throw in some dried berries or nuts, but judging by your bowl, today is not one of those days. The historical reality of Viking cuisine was largely dictated by survival rather than pleasure. They ate what they could grow, catch, or steal, and preservation was everything. Most of their diet consisted of grains, dairy products, and whatever protein they could manage: fish, meat, or the occasional seabird unlucky enough to cross their path. Vegetables were scarce and often viewed with suspicion, which explains why scurvy was such a common problem on long voyages. But here's a fascinating tidbit that most people don't know. Vikings were actually quite innovative with fermentation. They didn't just ferment their drinks, they fermented fish, creating a delicacy called rackfisk that was essentially controlled fish rot. The process took months and resulted in something that smelled like a combination of cheese and low tide. But it was packed with nutrients and could last through the harsh winter months. You take your first tentative spoonful of the porridge, and your taste buds immediately file a formal complaint. It's not just bland, it's aggressively flavorless, as if someone went out of their way to remove any hint of taste. The texture is somewhere between wet sand and library paste, and it sticks to your teeth with the determination of medieval dental cement. The Viking next to you notices your expression and grins, revealing teeth that have clearly seen better centuries. He says something in Old Norse that you don't understand, but his tone suggests he's either offering encouragement or making fun of your obvious distress. He then demonstrates the proper technique for eating Viking porridge. You don't chew it, you just sort of endure it until it slides down your throat. To wash down this culinary adventure, you're offered a horn filled with what appears to be milk, but not the kind you're used to. This is fresh goat's milk, still warm and with a distinctly gamey flavor that makes you wonder if the goat had strong opinions about what it ate. The milk is rich and creamy, but it has an underlying taste that's somewhere between barnyard and cheese that's been left out too long. Historians still argue whether Vikings regularly consumed cow's milk, or if goat and sheep milk were more common. But archaeological evidence suggests that dairy was a crucial part of their diet. They made various types of cheese, including a hard cheese called gamelost, that could last for months without spoiling, mainly because it was so strong that even bacteria were afraid of it. The breakfast experience gets more interesting when someone produces what looks like bread, but turns out to be something called hardtack, a dense, flat bread that's been baked until it achieves the consistency of edible concrete. You're supposed to dip it in your porridge to soften it, but even after soaking, it requires the jaw strength of a medieval siege engine to make any progress. As you struggle with your hardtack, you notice that some of the other Vikings are enjoying what appears to be actual meat for breakfast. These are clearly the higher-ranking members of the raiding party, and their morning meal includes strips of dried beef or pork, preserved in salt and smoke. The meat looks like leather and probably tastes similar, but compared to your porridge situation, it might as well be filet mignon. The social hierarchy of Viking meals was strictly observed. The Jarl and his closest warriors got the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread, and the strongest mead. Everyone else made do with whatever was left, which usually meant a lot of porridge and the occasional piece of fish that had seen better days. But here's where Viking breakfast gets truly medieval. They often started their day with a drink called bjor, which was a low-alcohol beer that was safer to drink than water. Yes, Vikings were essentially day drinking as a health measure, because their water sources were often contaminated with things that would make modern health inspectors weep. You finish your porridge through sheer determination, and immediately feel your stomach staging a small rebellion. The combination of unfamiliar foods, questionable preparation methods, and the general stress of time travel has created a digestive situation that you're pretty sure wasn't covered in any history textbook. Now comes the moment you've been dreading, getting dressed like a Viking. And let me tell you, medieval fashion was designed by people who clearly believed that comfort was a sign of weakness. First, you're handed what appears to be underwear, except it's made of rough linen that feels like it was woven from tree bark and regret. This is your braise, essentially medieval boxer shorts that tie at the waist and extend down to your knees. The linen is undyed, unbleached, and has the texture of sandpaper that's been left out in the rain. As you pull them on, you immediately understand why Vikings were always ready for battle. They were probably trying to escape their clothing. Next comes the tunic, which sounds elegant until you realize it's basically a potato sack with sleeves. The wool is thick, scratchy, and dyed in what can only be described as medieval brown, a color that suggests it was achieved by soaking the fabric in mud and hoping for the best. The tunic reaches down to your mid-thigh and has all the tailoring sophistication of a burlap bag with ambitions. The historical reality of Viking clothing was entirely practical. They needed garments that could withstand harsh weather, constant wear, and the occasional sword fight. Fashion was secondary to function, and function meant surviving another day in a world where central heating was still 1,000 years away. Most Vikings owned only 2 or 3 sets of clothes, and they wore them until they literally fell apart. But here's something fascinating. Vikings were actually quite vain about their appearance. They spent considerable time and resources on personal grooming, jewelry, and decorative elements for their clothing. Archaeological evidence shows that Viking graves often contain combs, tweezers, and even small scissors, suggesting that looking good was important even in the afterlife. Over the tunic goes a leather jerkin, which is supposed to provide protection, but mainly serves to make you feel like you're wearing a very expensive straitjacket. The leather is thick, stiff, and has been treated with what smells like a combination of animal fat and regret. It creaks when you move, restricts your breathing, and makes you wonder if medieval people ever sat down comfortably. The trousers are perhaps the most challenging part of the ensemble. They're made of wool that's been woven so tightly it could probably stop arrows. But they're also cut in a way that suggests the tailor had only a vague understanding of human anatomy. They're simultaneously too tight in some places and too loose in others, creating a fit that's both restrictive and baggy, a combination that shouldn't be possible but somehow is. Historians still argue whether Vikings wore their trousers tucked into their boots or wrapped with leg bindings, but archaeological evidence suggests both methods were used depending on the activity and weather conditions. What we do know is that Viking trousers were designed for mobility during combat, which explains why they feel like they're constantly trying to trip you. The socks are a particular form of medieval torture. They're made of wool that's been felted to the consistency of cardboard, and they extend up to your knees like some kind of primitive compression stockings. They're held up by leather straps that cut into your legs, and they have the amazing ability to be both too tight and too loose simultaneously. But the real adventure begins with the boots. These aren't the sleek leather boots you see in movies. They're more like leather bags that someone decided to call footwear. They're made from a single piece of leather that's been sewn together with sinew, and they have no left or right foot distinction. You just put them on and hope your feet eventually conform to their shape. The boots are designed to be worn with multiple layers of wool wrappings, which serve as both insulation and padding. Without these wrappings, the boots would be unwearable, but with them, your feet feel like they're wrapped in wet blankets. The leather is thick and waterproof, but it's also completely inflexible, so walking feels like you're wearing wooden clogs made of cowhide. Here's a quirky detail that most people don't know. Vikings often stuffed their boots with moss or dried grass for extra insulation. This wasn't just for warmth. The organic material would absorb moisture and could be changed out regularly. It was basically the medieval equivalent of moisture-wicking athletic socks, except it involved foraging for foot stuffing. As you struggle with the final layers of your outfit, you realize that getting dressed as a Viking is a full-body workout. Every piece of clothing requires wrestling, adjusting, and what can only be described as negotiation. The wool is scratchy against your skin, the leather is stiff and unforgiving, and everything smells like it's been stored in a barn for several seasons. The final touch is a woolen cloak that's supposed to provide warmth and protection from the elements. It's held in place by a large bronze brooch that's both decorative and functional, but mainly serves to remind you that you're now wearing approximately 30 pounds of meat. Time for weapons training, and you're about to discover that medieval warfare was less heroic battle and more trying not to accidentally kill yourself with your own equipment. The first weapon thrust into your hands is a seax, a single-edged knife that's supposed to be your constant companion. It's about the length of your forearm, wickedly sharp, and has a handle wrapped in leather that's been worn smooth by countless hands. The blade gleams with a dull, businesslike shine that suggests it's seen plenty of action, and not all of it was cutting bread. Your instructor, a grizzled Viking who looks like he's been personally carved from oak, demonstrates the proper grip. He makes it look effortless, twirling the seax like it's an extension of his arm. When you try to copy him, you nearly drop it twice and manage to slice through your own belt. The other Vikings find this hilarious, which doesn't help your confidence. The historical reality of Viking weapons was that they were tools first and symbols second. Every Viking carried a seax, because it was useful for everything from eating to fighting to general utility work. These weren't ceremonial weapons. They were practical tools that could gut a fish, carve wood, or defend your life, often in the same day. But here's something most people don't realize. Viking weapons were incredibly expensive. A good sword could cost the equivalent of several farms, which is why most Vikings fought with axes, spears, and seaxes. Only the wealthy could afford the high-quality steel that made legendary weapons, and these were often passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Next comes the axe, and this is where things get really interesting. The weapon handed to you isn't the massive two-handed battle axe you see in movies. It's a bearded axe, named for the extended lower edge that resembles facial hair. It's surprisingly light, well-balanced, and designed for one-handed use, which means you can hold a shield in your other hand. The axe head is attached to a wooden handle that's been seasoned and shaped with the kind of craftsmanship that modern machine tools would envy. The steel is pattern welded, creating swirling designs in the metal that are both beautiful and functional. The edge is sharp enough to shave with, assuming you're brave enough to try. Your instructor shows you the basic strikes: overhead chop, horizontal sweep, and the dreaded beard hook that can catch an opponent's weapon or shield. Each movement requires precise timing and body mechanics that take years to master. You manage to hit the practice target exactly once out of 10 attempts, and even then, you nearly lose your balance. The shield is perhaps the most important part of your equipment, and also the most awkward. It's round, made of wooden planks bound together with iron, and painted with symbols that probably mean something important but look like abstract art to you. The shield is held by a central grip, and it's heavier than you expected. About 10 pounds of wood and metal that you're supposed to maneuver with one arm. Historians still argue whether Viking shields were primarily offensive or defensive weapons, but archaeological evidence suggests they were used for both. Shield walls were a fundamental Viking tactic, where warriors would overlap their shields to create an impenetrable barrier. The shield could also be used to bash opponents or to hook their weapons. The spear is the weapon that really drives home how unprepared you are for medieval combat. It's about 8 feet long, with a leaf-shaped iron point that's been honed to surgical sharpness. The shaft is made of ash wood, chosen for its flexibility and strength, and it's been polished smooth by countless hands. Spear fighting looks simple in movies, but in reality, it requires incredible coordination and timing. You're supposed to thrust, parry, and maneuver while maintaining your balance and watching for counterattacks. The spear is surprisingly heavy at the tip, which means controlling it requires constant muscle engagement. After 5 minutes of practice, your arms are shaking like leaves. Here's a fascinating detail. Vikings often used their spears as walking sticks during long marches, which is why the shafts were made so durable. The spear point could be removed and stored separately, turning the weapon into a practical hiking aid. This dual-purpose design was typical of Viking practicality. The helmet situation is where reality crashes into Hollywood fantasy. You're not getting a horned helmet. Those never existed in Viking culture and would have been tactically suicidal. Instead, you're fitted with a simple iron cap that looks like a metal bowl with a nose guard. It's called a spangenhelm, and it's designed to deflect blows rather than absorb them. The helmet is surprisingly heavy and sits awkwardly on your head, constantly shifting and blocking your peripheral vision. The nose guard. Welcome to Viking rowing boot camp, where you'll discover that teamwork takes on a whole new meaning when failure means everyone dies together in the North Sea. The longship looms before you like a wooden dragon, and your first thought is that it's simultaneously too big and too small. Too big because it's about 75 feet of carved oak that somehow needs to be propelled by human power alone. Too small because you're about to spend the next several hours crammed into it with 30 other Vikings who have a casual relationship with personal hygiene. Your assigned seat is on a rowing bench that's been worn smooth by countless previous occupants, and you quickly realize that seat is a generous term. It's more like a wooden plank that's been positioned at exactly the wrong height for comfortable sitting. The oar placed in your hands is a massive piece of ash wood that's about 12 feet long, and weighs roughly the same as a small tree, which, technically, it recently was. The rowing technique demonstrated by your bench partner looks deceptively simple. Reach forward, dip the blade, pull back, lift, repeat. What they don't mention is that this needs to be done in perfect synchronization with 29 other people, while the boat is moving in potentially rough seas for hours at a time. It's like trying to conduct an orchestra where every musician is wielding a 12-foot wooden instrument, and a single wrong note could capsize everyone. The historical reality of Viking longships was that they were marvels of medieval engineering. These vessels could travel in water as shallow as 3 feet, could be carried overland when necessary, and were fast enough to outrun most pursuit. The design hadn't changed much in centuries because it was already perfect for its purpose, getting Vikings to their destination quickly and getting them out even faster. But here's something most people don't know. Viking longships were actually quite fragile. The hull was made of overlapping oak planks held together with iron rivets and sealed with tar and animal hair. They were designed for speed and maneuverability, not durability. A single sharp rock could punch a hole that would sink the entire vessel, which is why Vikings were so careful about where they landed. The rowing begins, and you immediately understand why Vikings had such impressive upper body strength. Each stroke requires you to engage your entire core, pull with your arms, push with your legs, and somehow maintain perfect timing with everyone else. The oar feels like it's fighting you. The water seems determined to grab your blade at the wrong angle, and your back starts protesting after about 30 seconds. The rhythm is everything. The Vikings have a chant that helps maintain the pace, but it's in Old Norse and sounds like a combination of work song and death metal. You try to follow along, but mainly you're focused on not catching a crab, rowing terminology for when your oar gets stuck in the water and either breaks or launches you backward off your bench. Historians still argue whether Viking longships were primarily powered by sail or oar, but archaeological evidence suggests that rowing was the primary means of propulsion during raids. The sail was useful for long-distance travel, but when you needed precise maneuvering or had to move against the wind, it was all about human power. After about 10 minutes of rowing, your hands are already developing blisters despite the calluses you can see on every other Viking's palms. The repetitive motion is creating friction in places you didn't know could develop friction. And you're starting to understand why medieval people had such a different relationship with physical pain. The longship's motion is unlike anything you've experienced. It's not the gentle rocking of a modern boat. It's more like riding a wooden roller coaster that's been designed by someone with a grudge against human comfort. The vessel flexes and twists with each wave, and you can actually feel the hull bending beneath you. This is apparently normal and even desirable, as rigid boats would break apart in rough seas. Your rowing partner, who's been watching your technique with the patience of someone who's seen many beginners struggle, finally offers some advice in broken English mixed with Old Norse. The key, he explains through gestures and grunts, is to let the boat do the work. You're not supposed to fight the motion, you're supposed to become part of it. This sounds very zen until you try to put it into practice and immediately catch another crab, this time managing to splash the Viking behind you with cold seawater. His reaction suggests that this is not the first time a novice has baptized him during rowing practice, but his patience is clearly wearing thin. The physical demands of longship rowing were so intense that Vikings developed a specific body type. Archaeological analysis of Viking skeletons shows enlarged shoulder bones, pronounced muscle attachment points, and signs of repetitive stress injuries that are consistent with years of rowing. These weren't weekend warriors. They were professional athletes whose sport happened to involve raiding coastal settlements. Here's a quirky detail that brings the whole experience into perspective. Viking longships had no bathrooms. When nature called during a long voyage, you had to either hold it or figure out a way to relieve yourself over the side while maintaining your rowing rhythm. This added a whole new dimension to the concept of teamwork and timing. As the rowing session continues, you begin to understand that this isn't just about propelling a boat. It's about becoming part of a machine where every component has to work perfectly, or the whole system. The North Sea has decided to personally introduce you to the concept of medieval motion sickness, and it's not being gentle about it. The longship that felt sturdy on shore now feels like a wooden toothpick being tossed around by an angry giant with a serious grudge against Vikings. The waves aren't the gentle swells you might imagine from watching documentaries. These are proper North Sea waves, gray, cold, and aggressive, each one seemingly designed to test whether your breakfast porridge was really worth eating. The longship climbs each wave like it's scaling a liquid mountain, pauses dramatically at the crest, then plunges down the other side with the enthusiasm of a wooden roller coaster that's forgotten about safety regulations. Your stomach, which was already questionable after the morning's culinary adventure, is now staging a full rebellion. The constant motion, up, down, twist, roll, creates a sensation that's somewhere between carnival ride and medieval torture device. You're gripping your oar with white knuckles, not because you're rowing effectively, but because it's the only thing keeping you anchored to reality. The historical reality of Viking sea travel was that seasickness was just another occupational hazard, like sword wounds or frostbite. These men spent months at sea, and they developed sea legs through sheer necessity. But for a modern person suddenly thrust into this environment, the North Sea feels like it's actively trying to turn you inside out. The other Vikings seem completely unaffected by the motion that's making you question every life choice that led to this moment. They're still rowing in perfect rhythm, still chanting their work songs, still looking like they're enjoying themselves. One of them even has the audacity to be eating dried fish while the boat pitches and rolls. You watch him chew contentedly and wonder if Vikings were actually human or some kind of sea-adapted subspecies. But here's something fascinating about Viking seamanship. They navigated these treacherous waters without compasses, GPS, or even accurate maps. They used a combination of sunstones, wave patterns, bird behavior, and what can only be described as supernatural intuition. The sunstone was a type of crystal that could locate the sun even through heavy clouds, allowing them to maintain their bearing even in the worst weather. The spray from the waves is constant and icy, soaking through your woolen clothes with the persistence of medieval water torture. Each wave that breaks over the bow sends a shower of North Sea water cascading down the length of the ship, and you quickly learn that there's no such thing as staying dry on a Viking longship. The water is shockingly cold, cold enough to make you gasp involuntarily and wonder if hypothermia was just another thing Vikings considered character building. Your rowing technique, which was questionable on calm water, becomes completely useless in these conditions. The oar blade catches waves at wrong angles, sending shocks up your arms that feel like you're trying to row through concrete. Sometimes the oar hits nothing but air as the boat drops into a trough, leaving you flailing like you're trying to row through clouds. Historians still argue whether Vikings deliberately chose rough weather for their raids or simply accepted it as inevitable. But archaeological evidence suggests they were remarkably skilled at reading weather patterns. They could predict storms hours in advance and knew exactly when conditions would be favorable for different types of voyages. The seasickness hits you in waves, pun intended, starting with a queasy feeling that gradually builds to full-blown nausea. Your mouth fills with saliva, your skin becomes clammy, and you develop that special kind of dizziness that makes you want to lie down on something that isn't constantly moving. Unfortunately, lying down isn't an option when you're supposed to be rowing. The Viking next to you notices your distress and offers what appears to be advice, though it's delivered in Old Norse with a tone that suggests he's either being helpful or making fun of you. He demonstrates a breathing technique that involves deep, rhythmic breaths timed to the rowing stroke. It's actually quite effective, though you suspect he's also enjoying watching you struggle with basic human functions. Here's a detail that makes the whole experience even more challenging. Viking longships had no shelter. There was no cabin to retreat to, no below-deck area to escape the weather. You were exposed to the elements for the entire journey, whether that was a few hours or several days. Rain, spray, wind, and sun. You experienced it all with nothing but your woolen cloak for protection. The constant motion also affects your balance in ways you didn't expect. Standing up becomes an adventure in physics, as the deck tilts and shifts beneath your feet with each wave. Walking requires a completely different technique, a kind of controlled stumble that involves anticipating the boat's movement and adjusting your center of gravity accordingly. As the hours pass, you begin to understand that seasickness isn't just about nausea. It's about the complete disruption of your body's normal functions. Your depth perception becomes unreliable, your coordination suffers, and even simple tasks like drinking water become challenging when the cup keeps moving independently of your mouth. The psychological aspect is almost worse than the physical discomfort. The constant motion creates a feeling of helplessness, as if you're completely at the mercy of forces beyond your control, which, of course, you are. The North Sea doesn't care about your comfort, your schedule, or your modern sensibilities. Land appears on the horizon like a medieval mirage, and suddenly everyone's energy shifts from enduring voyage to preparing for violence. The transition is jarring. One moment you're focused on not throwing up, the next you're supposed to be ready for combat. The coastline ahead looks deceptively peaceful. Rolling green hills, scattered trees, and what appears to be a small settlement nestled in a protected bay. It's the kind of scenery that would make a lovely postcard, except you're about to participate in ruining someone's day in the most Viking way possible. The irony isn't lost on you that this beautiful landscape is about to become the backdrop for your medieval nightmare. As the longship approaches the shore, you realize that landing a Viking vessel isn't like docking a modern boat. There's no pier, no harbor, no convenient place to tie up. Instead, the Vikings are preparing to beach the ship directly on the shore, which involves a controlled crash that requires precise timing and more teamwork than you've managed to demonstrate so far. The water becomes shallower, changing from deep blue to murky brown, and you can see the bottom rushing up to meet the hull. The Vikings ship their oars in perfect unison, a maneuver you completely miss, leaving you as the only person still trying to row while everyone else prepares for landing. The looks you get suggest this is not the first time a newcomer has failed to read the obvious signals. The historical reality of Viking raids was that the element of surprise was crucial. These ships were designed to appear suddenly on a coastline, disgorge their warriors, and disappear just as quickly. The shallow draft meant they could land almost anywhere, turning any beach into a potential invasion point. Coastal communities lived in constant fear of seeing that distinctive dragon-headed silhouette on the horizon. The ship grinds against the sandy bottom with a sound that makes you wince, but the Vikings treat it like a normal parking maneuver. Before you can fully process what's happening, half the crew is over the side, splashing through knee-deep water to drag the ship further up the beach. The efficiency is impressive and terrifying. These men have clearly done this many times before. Your first step onto foreign soil is less heroic invasion and more stumbling disaster. The combination of sea legs, heavy equipment, and general inexperience means you immediately sink ankle-deep into what turns out to be not sand, but mud. Cold, sticky, clingy mud that seems determined to keep your boots as a souvenir. The other Vikings navigate this terrain like they're walking on solid ground, while you struggle with each step like you're trying to escape quicksand. But here's something most people don't realize about Viking raids. They weren't random acts of violence. These were carefully planned military operations, often based on intelligence gathered from previous trading expeditions. Vikings knew exactly where to find the most valuable targets and the best escape routes. They were professional soldiers, not mindless barbarians. The local wildlife seems personally offended by your presence. A flock of seabirds erupts from the nearby marsh, screaming what sounds like medieval profanity in bird language. Their cries are loud enough to wake the dead, which is problematic when you're supposed to be conducting a surprise attack. One of the Vikings mutters something that's probably a curse, and gives you a look that suggests you're somehow responsible for the bird's poor timing. The terrain between the beach and the settlement is an obstacle course of tussock grass, hidden streams, and what appears to be a small bog that's determined to swallow anyone foolish enough to step in it. The Vikings move through this landscape with the confidence of people who have spent their lives navigating difficult terrain, while you stumble from one hazard to the next like a tourist in a particularly hostile nature preserve. Historians still argue whether Viking raids were primarily economic ventures or expressions of cultural values, but the evidence suggests they were both. Raiding was a way to acquire wealth, but it was also how young men proved their worth and established their reputations. For Vikings, successful raiding was both profitable and socially necessary. The settlement ahead is starting to show signs of life. Smoke rises from cooking fires, and you can see figures moving between the buildings. These are real people going about their daily lives, completely unaware that their morning is about to be interrupted by a group of armed Scandinavians with questionable hygiene and aggressive intentions. The moral implications of what you're about to participate in start to sink in, and they're not comfortable. Your equipment, which felt awkward but manageable on the ship, now feels like it's actively trying to sabotage you. The shield keeps catching on brambles, the axe handle gets tangled in your cloak, and the spear seems determined to trip you at every opportunity. You're supposed to be a fearsome warrior, but you're moving through the landscape like a one-person percussion section. The other Vikings are spreading out into what's clearly a practiced formation. They move with the fluid coordination of a unit that's worked together for years, each person knowing exactly where they need to be and what they need to do. You, on the other hand, are trying to figure out which end of your spear is supposed to point forward while simultaneously attempting not to fall into the bog. Here's a detail that adds to the surreal nature of the situation. The morning is actually quite beautiful. The sun is breaking through the clouds, birds are singing when they're not screaming at you, and there's a fresh breeze carrying the scent of wild flowers. It's the kind of morning that should involve peaceful contemplation, not armed invasion. The disconnect between the lovely setting and your violent purpose creates a cognitive dissonance that's almost as disorienting as the seasickness. As you struggle through the marsh grass, you catch your first glimpse of the local inhabitants. They're going about their morning routines, tending animals, preparing food. The raid begins with all the coordination of a medieval flash mob, except everyone's armed, and you're the only one who doesn't know the choreography. The Vikings around you transform from travel companions into something altogether more frightening. Professional warriors who have suddenly remembered why they're here. The signal to attack comes in the form of a war cry that sounds like it was designed to wake the dead and terrify the living. It's a sound that starts deep in the chest and builds to a roar that seems to come from somewhere primal and violent. You try to join in, but your contribution sounds more like a question than a battle cry, earning you several concerned looks from your fellow raiders. The charge toward the settlement is supposed to be intimidating and coordinated. In reality, it's chaos with weapons. The Vikings spread out in a loose line, each warrior moving with practiced efficiency toward predetermined targets. You, meanwhile, are trying to run while carrying more medieval hardware than you know what to do with, creating a personal obstacle course that would be comedic if it weren't so potentially lethal. Your first real encounter with combat comes when a local villager, a man who was probably just trying to check on his chickens, suddenly finds himself face to face with a group of armed Scandinavians. His expression goes through several stages: confusion, recognition, and then pure terror. He drops his basket of eggs and runs, which seems like the most sensible response anyone's had to this situation so far. The historical reality of Viking raids was that they were often over quickly. The goal wasn't prolonged siege warfare. It was to strike fast, take what was valuable, and leave before organized resistance could form. Speed and shock were more important than individual heroics, which is why Viking tactics emphasized coordinated group attacks rather than single combat. But here's where your modern sensibilities clash violently with medieval reality. This isn't a movie where the violence is sanitized and the consequences are abstract. These are real people whose lives are being turned upside down by your presence. The moral weight of participating in a raid, even as an unwilling time traveler, starts to settle on your shoulders like a lead blanket. The settlement erupts into chaos as people realize what's happening. Doors slam shut, children are pulled inside, and the few men who might offer resistance are trying to organize some kind of defense with farming tools and whatever weapons they can find. It's David versus Goliath, except Goliath has professional military training and David is armed with a pitchfork. Your role in this chaos is supposed to be that of a fearsome warrior, but you're mainly trying not to trip over your own equipment while simultaneously questioning every decision that led to this moment. The axe in your hands feels impossibly heavy, the shield keeps banging against your legs, and you're pretty sure you're holding the spear wrong. The other Vikings are moving through the settlement with practiced efficiency, but their targets aren't what you might expect from Hollywood depictions. They're not interested in pointless destruction. They're looking for portable wealth. Silver, jewelry, fine cloth, and anything else that can be easily carried and traded. This is business, not random violence. Historians still argue whether Viking raids were primarily motivated by economic necessity or cultural tradition. But archaeological evidence suggests that successful raiders often used their wealth to buy land and establish themselves as respectable members of society. Raiding was a young man's game, a way to acquire the resources needed for a more settled life. The first building you enter is a small house that smells like bread and fear. The family inside has barricaded themselves in a back room, and you can hear whispered prayers in a language you don't understand. The Vikings with you are systematically searching for anything valuable, but they're not being unnecessarily destructive. They're professionals doing a job, not monsters reveling in chaos. You're supposed to be helping with the search, but mainly you're standing in the doorway trying to process the surreal nature of your situation. The house is cozy and well-maintained, with evidence of a family life that was completely normal until about 5 minutes ago. There are children's toys, cooking utensils, and personal belongings that speak to lives lived with care and attention. The loot you're supposed to be collecting turns out to be disappointingly mundane. A few silver coins, some decent cloth, a bronze brooch that might be worth something. This isn't the treasure hoard of legend. It's the modest savings of people who work hard for everything they have. The disconnect between the epic nature of Viking raids in popular culture and the reality of taking someone's life savings is jarring. Here's a detail that makes the whole experience even more uncomfortable. Many of the Vikings are trying to minimize unnecessary harm. They're not killing indiscriminately or destroying property for fun. They're taking what they need and trying to get out quickly. It's still robbery and intimidation, but it's professional robbery and intimidation. The sound of your own breathing is unnaturally loud in the confined space, and you realize you're hyperventilating. The combination of adrenaline, moral conflict, and the general stress of medieval combat is creating a physiological response that's making it hard to think clearly. Your hands are shaking, your vision is slightly tunneled, and you're pretty sure this is what a panic attack feels like. As you stumble through your first Viking raid, you begin to understand that this isn't about glory or heroism. It's about survival in a world where might makes right and the strong take from the weak. The Vikings aren't evil, but they're operating in a moral framework that's completely alien to modern sensibilities. The looting phase of your Viking career turns out to be less discovering ancient treasure and more awkward medieval moving service with weapons. You're quickly learning that stealing things is significantly more complicated than movies make it appear, especially when those things belong to people who are understandably upset about the whole situation. Your first assignment is to help carry a large wooden chest that supposedly contains valuables. The chest is made of oak, bound with iron, and weighs approximately the same as a small car. The Vikings who have done this before grab it with practiced efficiency. But your contribution mainly involves getting in the way and making grunting noises that don't actually help move the object. The contents of the chest, when finally opened, are a perfect example of the gap between expectation and reality. Instead of gold coins and precious gems, you find carefully folded linens, some silver spoons, a few pieces of jewelry that look handmade, and what appears to be someone's life savings in the form of small silver coins. It's valuable, but it's also clearly everything this family owns of worth. The historical reality of Viking loot was that most of it was practical rather than spectacular. Silver was preferred because it could be weighed and divided easily among the crew. Jewelry was valuable not just for its materials, but because it could be melted down and reformed. Cloth was actually quite precious in the medieval world. Good fabric took enormous amounts of time and skill to produce. But here's where the logistics of medieval theft become truly challenging. Everything is heavy, bulky, or both. That beautiful tapestry you're supposed to steal weighs about 40 pounds and is awkward to carry. The silver chalice from the local church is tarnished and dented, and you're not entirely sure it's actually silver. The precious furs turn out to be infested with fleas that seem delighted to find new hosts. Your next target is the local livestock, and this is where your Viking career takes a turn toward the absurd. You're supposed to help round up sheep, goats, and chickens for transport back to the ship. The problem is that medieval farm animals have strong opinions about being relocated, and they're not shy about expressing them. The sheep are surprisingly fast and agile, capable of changing direction with the suddenness of furry missiles. The goats are actively malicious, seeming to take personal offense at your presence, and responding with headbutts that are both painful and humiliating. The chickens are pure chaos in feathered form, squawking and flapping with the intensity of tiny dinosaurs who have remembered their prehistoric heritage. Historians still argue whether livestock was a primary target of Viking raids or simply a convenient bonus, but archaeological evidence suggests that animals were often more valuable than material goods. A good milk cow could feed a family for years, while silver coins might be spent in a season. Live animals were walking, breathing investments. The process of actually catching these animals reveals another gap in your medieval skill set. The Vikings around you approach livestock herding with the same professional competence they bring to everything else. They know exactly how to corner a sheep, how to grab a chicken without getting pecked to death, and how to convince a goat that cooperation is in everyone's best interest. You, on the other hand, are engaged in what can only be described as medieval slapstick. You chase a particularly stubborn goose around a farmyard for what feels like hours, only to have it escape at the last moment while somehow managing to bite you in the process. Yes, geese can bite, and yes, it hurts more than you'd expect. Here's a detail that adds insult to injury. The local farm animals seem to sense your incompetence and are actively working against you. The sheep you're trying to herd keep doubling back. The chickens appear to be coordinating their escape attempts, and one particularly intelligent pig seems to be deliberately leading you into mud puddles. The weight of everything you're supposed to carry back to the ship is becoming a serious problem. Medieval people were stronger than modern humans. They did physical labor all day, every day, from childhood. You, with your modern lifestyle and office job background, are discovering muscles you didn't know you had, and they're all complaining simultaneously. The silver you're carrying is particularly challenging because it's been formed into inconvenient shapes. Arm rings, neck torques, and decorative brooches might look elegant, but they're awkward to transport and have sharp edges that keep catching on your clothing. You're developing a collection of small cuts and scratches that make you look like you've been wrestling with an angry cat. The textiles present their own unique challenges. Medieval cloth was often treated with substances that modern noses find offensive. Urine for cleaning, various plant dyes that smell like rotting vegetation, and preservation methods that involve materials you'd rather not think about. You're carrying someone's finest fabrics, and they smell like a combination of wet dog and medieval chemistry experiment. As you struggle with your share of the loot, you begin to understand that Viking raids weren't just about the initial violence. They were complex logistical operations that required careful planning, efficient execution, and the ability to transport significant amounts of goods across difficult terrain and open water. The moral weight of what you're doing is made worse by the personal nature of the items you're stealing. This isn't anonymous wealth. It's someone's wedding jewelry, their best clothes, their carefully saved coins. Each item represents hours of work, years of saving, or generations of family history. The retreat begins with the universal Viking signal for time to leave before the locals organize a proper response, which sounds remarkably like panicked shouting in Old Norse. Suddenly, your fellow raiders are moving with the urgency of people who have just remembered that they're vastly outnumbered and far from home. The transition from confident raiders to concerned about survival happens faster than you can process. One moment you're struggling with a particularly uncooperative chicken. The next you're being hustled toward the beach by Vikings who are constantly looking over their shoulders. The professional calm that characterized the raid is replaced by the kind of focused intensity that suggests things are about to get significantly worse. Your first indication that the retreat isn't going according to plan comes in the form of arrows. Not the dramatic, slow-motion arrows of movie battles, but quick, business-like projectiles that appear with a whistle and thunk into the ground uncomfortably close to your feet. The locals have apparently found some proper weapons and are expressing their displeasure with your visit in the most direct way possible. The historical reality of Viking retreats was that they were often more dangerous than the initial raid. A successful raid depended on getting in and out quickly, before the local population could organize effective resistance. Once the element of surprise was lost, the raiders became vulnerable to counterattack by people who knew the terrain and had strong motivation to fight. Running while carrying stolen goods and wearing medieval armor turns out to be its own special form of torture. The loot that seemed manageable when you were walking becomes impossibly heavy when you're trying to move quickly. The silver arm rings keep sliding around, the cloth bundles shift and unbalance you, and the livestock you're supposed to be herding has apparently decided that this is the perfect time to stage a rebellion. The terrain that was merely difficult during the approach becomes actively hostile during the retreat. Every tussock of grass seems designed to trip you. Every hidden stream appears at exactly the wrong moment, and the bog that you carefully avoided earlier now seems to have expanded to cover half the landscape. You're moving through an obstacle course while people are shooting at you, and your medieval equipment is not helping. But here's where Viking training shows its value. The experienced raiders around you are handling the retreat with the same professional competence they brought to the raid itself. They're covering each other, managing their loads efficiently, and maintaining formation even while moving quickly over difficult ground. It's a masterclass in medieval military tactics, and you're the student who's failing every test. The arrows are getting closer, and you can hear the voices of your pursuers getting louder. The locals have apparently overcome their initial shock and are now actively hunting the people who just robbed them. Their motivation is understandably high, and they know the terrain better than you do. This is not a favorable tactical situation. Your shield, which was awkward during the raid, becomes a lifesaver during the retreat. You're holding it at the wrong angle and probably using it incorrectly. But it's the only thing between you and the increasingly accurate archery of people who have legitimate grievances against your presence. The sound of arrow points hitting wood is surprisingly loud and distinctly unpleasant. Historians still argue whether Viking raids typically faced organized resistance or relied on surprise to avoid combat entirely. But archaeological evidence suggests that successful raiders were those who could fight their way out when necessary. The retreat was often the most dangerous part of the entire operation. The livestock situation has devolved into complete chaos. The animals you spent so much effort capturing are now actively working against you, as if they've realized that escape during the retreat is their best chance for freedom. The goats are particularly vindictive, seeming to take personal satisfaction in making your retreat as difficult as possible. The weight of your equipment is becoming a serious problem. Medieval warriors were conditioned for this kind of physical stress, but your modern body is discovering limitations you didn't know existed. Your legs are shaking, your breathing is labored, and you're pretty sure you're developing blisters in places where blisters shouldn't be possible. The beach appears ahead like a medieval mirage, but it's still too far away for comfort. The longship is visible, pulled up on the shore where you left it, but the distance between your current position and safety feels like it's measured in miles rather than yards. Every step is a negotiation between your desire to move quickly and your body's increasing inability to cooperate. Here's a detail that makes the whole experience even more stressful. You can hear individual voices among your pursuers. These aren't anonymous enemies. They're people whose homes you just robbed, whose lives you just disrupted. They're angry, they're organized, and they're gaining ground. The final sprint to the longship is a blur of mud, panic, and the kind of physical exertion that makes you question whether humans were really designed for this kind of activity. You're running on pure adrenaline, carrying more weight than you should be able to manage, while people shoot arrows at you, and your equipment tries to trip you at every step. As you stumble toward the ship, you realize that this retreat isn't just about getting away from immediate danger. It's about survival in a world where the consequences of failure are measured in blood rather than embarrassment. Welcome to Viking emergency medicine, where the treatment is often worse than the injury, and the bedside manner involves a lot of grunting and questionable herbal remedies. After your chaotic retreat, you're discovering that medieval first aid makes modern healthcare look like a miracle of compassion and competence. Your first medical consultation begins when the Viking, who's apparently the closest thing to a doctor, examines the arrow wound in your shoulder. He's a grizzled man whose qualifications seem to be, has been injured many times and lived to tell about it. His diagnostic technique involves poking the wound with a dirty finger while making thoughtful humming noises that don't inspire confidence. The medical supplies available would make a modern paramedic weep. There's no antiseptic, no sterile bandages, no painkillers beyond alcohol, and certainly no antibiotics. Instead, you're treated to a collection of herbs, animal products, and what can only be described as medieval folk wisdom that's been passed down through generations of people who had a very different relationship with pain and infection. The historical reality of Viking medicine was that it was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. But sophisticated is relative when you're talking about the 9th century. Vikings had extensive knowledge of herbal remedies, bone setting, and wound treatment. They understood the importance of cleaning wounds and had developed techniques for dealing with common battlefield injuries. However, their understanding of infection and disease was limited by the medical knowledge of their era. The first treatment involves cleaning your wound with what appears to be fermented honey mixed with herbs. This sounds pleasant until you experience it, at which point you discover that medieval wound cleaning feels like being attacked by angry bees from the inside. The honey is supposed to prevent infection, and modern science has actually proven that honey has antibacterial properties. But knowing this doesn't make the experience any less excruciating. But here's something fascinating about Viking medical practices. They were actually quite advanced in their understanding of anatomy and surgery. Archaeological evidence shows that Vikings performed successful amputations, trepanation, drilling holes in skulls, and complex bone repairs. They had specialized tools for medical procedures and a sophisticated understanding of how the human body worked. The herbal remedies being applied to your various cuts and bruises represent centuries of accumulated knowledge about plant medicine. Willow bark for pain relief, which contains the same active ingredient as aspirin, yarrow for bleeding, and comfrey for bone healing. These weren't random folk remedies. They were effective treatments that had been tested through generations of trial and error. Your medical treatment continues with what can only be described as medieval physical therapy. The Viking medic manipulates your injured shoulder with the gentle touch of someone who's learned anatomy by breaking and fixing bones in the field. His technique involves a combination of massage, joint manipulation, and what feels like controlled violence designed to restore function through sheer force of will. Historians still argue whether Viking medical knowledge was primarily practical or included theoretical understanding, but archaeological evidence suggests they had a sophisticated grasp of both. Medical tools found in Viking graves include surgical instruments, bone needles for suturing, and specialized equipment for treating specific types of injuries. The pain management options available are limited but creative. There's a strong alcoholic drink that tastes like it was designed to strip pain, a bitter herbal tea that makes you question whether the cure is worse than the disease, and a technique involving pressure points that seems to work through the principle of distracting you with different pain. The psychological aspect of Viking medicine is perhaps the most interesting. These people lived with pain as a constant companion, and their approach to injury was fundamentally different from modern attitudes. Pain was expected, endured, and often seen as a test of character rather than something to be eliminated at all costs. Here's a detail that puts the whole experience in perspective. The Viking treating your wounds has scars that tell the story of a lifetime of violence and survival. Each mark represents an injury that was treated with the same methods being used on you. And the fact that he's alive and functional suggests that these techniques, however primitive they seem, were often effective. The bandaging process involves strips of linen that have been boiled and treated with various herbal preparations. The cloth is rough against your skin, and the binding technique seems designed more for durability than comfort. You're wrapped up like a medieval mummy, with layers of fabric that restrict movement but provide protection for your healing wounds. The final part of your medical treatment involves what can only be described as Viking bedside manner. This consists of practical advice delivered in a tone that suggests weakness is a personal failing, encouragement that sounds more like threats, and the kind of tough love that makes you wonder if sympathy was considered a character flaw in medieval Scandinavia. As you sit there, bandaged and medicated with substances that would probably be illegal in the modern world, you begin to understand that Viking medicine wasn't just about treating injuries. It was about maintaining a fighting force. The evening campfire gathering is your introduction to Viking social dynamics, and it's like attending a medieval fraternity party, where everyone's armed and the entertainment involves increasingly improbable stories about personal violence. The fire crackles with the kind of warmth that makes you temporarily forget about your various injuries, at least until someone passes you a drinking horn filled with what can only be described as liquid regret. The mead hits your palate like a combination of honey, alcohol, and what tastes suspiciously like fermented sadness. It's sweet, strong, and has an aftertaste that suggests the brewing process involved ingredients you'd rather not think about. The Vikings around you are drinking it with the enthusiasm of people who have never heard of quality control, and you quickly realize that refusing would be both rude and potentially dangerous. The storytelling begins almost immediately, and you discover that Viking oral tradition is less about historical accuracy and more about competitive exaggeration. The first tale involves a warrior who allegedly killed 12 enemies with a broken spear while standing on one leg during a thunderstorm. The story is told with such conviction that you almost believe it, until you remember that you've seen this particular storyteller struggle with basic tasks like tying his boots. The historical reality of Viking storytelling was that it served multiple purposes beyond entertainment. These stories preserved cultural values, taught moral lessons, and maintained group cohesion during long voyages and difficult campaigns. The sagas weren't just entertainment. They were the cultural DNA of Viking society, passed down through generations of warriors who understood that stories could be more powerful than swords. But here's where the evening takes a turn toward the surreal. The Vikings expect you to contribute to the storytelling. All eyes turn to you with the kind of expectation that suggests your social standing in the group depends on your ability to spin a tale that's both entertaining and appropriately violent. The problem is that Your most exciting life experiences involve traffic jams and difficult customers, neither of which translate well to medieval warrior culture. Your attempt at storytelling is met with polite confusion. You try to describe a particularly challenging day at work, but the concept of office politics doesn't translate well to people whose workplace conflicts are resolved with axes. The Vikings listen with the patience of people trying to understand a foreign language, occasionally exchanging glances that suggest they're wondering if you might have suffered a head injury during the retreat. The drinking continues, and you discover that Viking alcohol tolerance is apparently superhuman. The mead that's making you question your life choices seems to have no effect on your companions, who continue drinking with the steady determination of people who have built up immunity through years of practice. You're 3 sips in and already feeling like the world is tilting at odd angles. Historians still argue whether Viking drinking culture was primarily social or ritualistic, but archaeological evidence suggests it was both. Drinking horns, elaborate cups, and specialized brewing equipment found in Viking graves indicate that alcohol consumption was an important part of both daily life and religious ceremonies. The songs that accompany the drinking are unlike anything you've ever heard. They're part work chant, part battle cry, and part religious hymn, all delivered in voices that sound like they've been seasoned by years of shouting over North Sea winds. The melodies are haunting and repetitive, designed to be sung by groups of people who may or may not be entirely sober. Your attempts to join in the singing are met with the kind of tolerant amusement usually reserved for children trying to participate in adult activities. Your voice, trained on modern music with its emphasis on harmony and melody, sounds completely out of place among the rough, rhythmic chanting of your Viking companions. You're like a classical musician trying to play jazz, technically competent but culturally clueless. The evening's entertainment takes a competitive turn when someone suggests arm wrestling. This seems like harmless fun, until you realize that Viking arm wrestling is less about technique and more about the kind of raw strength that comes from a lifetime of rowing, fighting, and manual labor. Your first match lasts approximately 3 seconds and ends with your arm being slammed down with enough force to rattle your teeth. Here's a detail that makes the whole experience even more humbling. The Viking who just defeated you with casual ease is considered one of the smaller, weaker members of the group. The truly strong warriors haven't even bothered to participate, apparently viewing the competition as beneath their notice. You're not just losing, you're losing to the junior varsity team. The mead is affecting your judgment in ways that would be concerning if you weren't already in a situation where good judgment seems irrelevant. You find yourself agreeing to participate in increasingly questionable activities, including what appears to be a contest to see who can tell the most outrageous lie with a straight face. This is a competition you're uniquely qualified to lose. The fire burns lower as the evening progresses, and the conversation becomes more philosophical. The Vikings begin discussing concepts like honor, fate, and the proper way to die in battle. These aren't abstract concepts to them. They're practical considerations that affect daily decision-making. The casual way they discuss death and violence makes you realize how different their worldview is from anything you've ever experienced. As the night wears on, you begin to understand that this isn't just social drinking. It's a bonding ritual that reinforces group identity and hierarchy. Every story, every song, every shared drink is part of a complex social system that determines who belongs and who doesn't. And right now, night watch duty turns out to be the medieval equivalent of being handed a participation trophy in the world's most dangerous game of hide and seek. You're given a spear, pointed toward the darkness, and told to wake everyone if you see anything suspicious, which, given your current state of medieval paranoia, includes every shadow, sound, and suspicious-looking tree. The darkness beyond the campfire is absolute in a way that modern people rarely experience. There are no streetlights, no distant glow from cities, no comforting hum of civilization. Just an endless black void that seems to be actively watching you with the patience of something that has all night to make your life miserable. Your eyes strain against the darkness, creating shapes and movements that may or may not be real. The sounds of the night are a symphony of potential threats. Every rustling bush could be an enemy scout, every snapping twig might signal an approaching attack, and every owl hoot sounds like a signal between hostile forces. Your imagination, fueled by exhaustion and residual mead, transforms the peaceful countryside into a landscape crawling with dangers that probably don't exist but feel absolutely real. The historical reality of Viking night watches was that they were crucial for survival. Raiders were vulnerable during rest periods, and surprise attacks were a constant threat. The watch system was carefully organized, with experienced warriors taking the most dangerous shifts and newcomers like yourself getting the relatively safer middle-of-the-night duty. Even so, falling asleep on watch was considered a serious offense that could result in severe punishment. Your fellow watch companion is a taciturn Viking who communicates primarily through grunts and meaningful looks. He's clearly been assigned to babysit you, and his attitude suggests he's not thrilled about the arrangement. He demonstrates the proper way to hold your spear, scan the perimeter, and signal for help, all with the patience of someone who's done this countless times before. But here's where the psychological pressure of night watch becomes truly challenging. The responsibility. You're not just staying awake, you're responsible for the lives of 30 sleeping warriors who trust you to keep them safe. The weight of that responsibility sits on your shoulders like a lead blanket, making every shadow seem more threatening and every sound more ominous. The cold is relentless and seems to seep through your medieval clothing with the persistence of water through a sieve. Your wool cloak, which felt adequate during the day, now seems as effective as tissue paper against the night air. The fire provides warmth, but only if you stay close to it, and your watch duties require you to patrol the perimeter where the cold waits like a patient predator. The fatigue hits you in waves, each one stronger than the last. Your body, already exhausted from the day's activities, is now being asked to stay alert during the hours when every instinct is telling you to sleep. Your eyelids feel like they're made of lead, and you catch yourself nodding off while standing up, a skill you didn't know you possessed. Historians still argue whether Viking night attacks were common or primarily used as psychological warfare, but archaeological evidence suggests that most raids occurred during daylight hours when visibility was better. However, the threat of night attacks was real enough that elaborate watch systems were maintained throughout any extended stay in hostile territory. The spear in your hands becomes heavier as the night progresses, and you begin to understand why medieval weapons were designed for efficiency rather than comfort. What felt manageable for a few minutes becomes a burden after hours of constant vigilance. Your arms ache, your back protests, and you're developing a new appreciation for the physical demands of medieval warfare. Your watch partner occasionally disappears into the darkness to check the perimeter, leaving you alone with your thoughts and fears. These solo moments are the worst part of the entire experience, as your imagination fills the silence with every possible threat. The darkness seems to press in around you, and you find yourself jumping at sounds that are probably just small animals going about their nocturnal business. Here's a detail that makes the whole experience even more nerve-wracking. You have no idea what you're actually supposed to be watching for. Enemy warriors, wild animals, supernatural threats that medieval people took seriously. Your briefing was minimal, and your cultural knowledge doesn't extend to the specific dangers that might threaten a Viking camp in hostile territory. The psychological effects of sleep deprivation begin to manifest in ways that would be concerning if you weren't already in a situation where concern seems inadequate. You start seeing movement in your peripheral vision that disappears when you look directly at it. Sounds become distorted, and you begin to question whether that rustling in the bushes is wind or something more sinister. The stars above provide the only light, and you realize that medieval people had a completely different relationship with the night sky. Without light pollution, the stars are brilliant and numerous, creating a celestial display that's both beautiful and alien. The constellations are the same ones you know, but they seem brighter and more immediate, as if they're actually relevant to your survival. As the night drags on, you begin to understand that this isn't just about staying awake. It's about maintaining the kind of vigilance that could mean the difference between life and death. The homesickness hits you like a medieval sledgehammer to the soul, and suddenly, every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted feels like a lost paradise that you'll never see again. You're sitting by the dying campfire, surrounded by snoring Vikings, and all you can think about is the simple pleasure of a hot shower, a soft bed, and food that doesn't require archaeological investigation to identify. The bathroom situation alone is enough to make you question every decision that led to this moment. Medieval people had a very different relationship with personal hygiene and bodily functions, and their solutions to basic human needs range from primitive to downright alarming. The facilities consist of a designated area downwind from the camp, some leaves that you hope aren't poisonous, and a level of privacy that wouldn't satisfy a particularly modest exhibitionist. Your modern digestive system is staging a full rebellion against the medieval diet, creating internal weather patterns that would make a meteorologist weep. The combination of unfamiliar foods, questionable water sources, and the general stress of time travel has created a gastrointestinal situation that medieval medicine is spectacularly unequipped to handle. The historical reality of medieval sanitation was that it was a constant health hazard that people simply accepted as part of life. Disease was common, life expectancy was short, and the connection between cleanliness and health wasn't well understood. What seems like basic hygiene to modern people was luxury that most medieval folks couldn't afford or didn't know they needed. But here's what makes the homesickness truly crushing. It's not just about physical comfort. You're missing the entire social and cultural framework that made your life make sense. The language, the customs, the shared references, the basic understanding of how the world works, all of that is gone, replaced by a system that operates on completely different principles. You find yourself fantasizing about things that seemed mundane just days ago. The ability to flip a switch and have light. The miracle of turning a handle and having clean water appear. The luxury of clothes that fit properly and don't smell like they've been stored in a barn. The simple pleasure of food that's been prepared with some consideration for flavor rather than just survival. The social isolation is perhaps worse than the physical discomfort. You're surrounded by people, but you can't really communicate with them beyond basic gestures and the few words of Old Norse you've managed to pick up. Every conversation is a struggle, every joke falls flat, and every attempt at connection is hampered by the vast cultural gulf between your world and theirs. Historians still argue whether medieval people experienced homesickness in the same way modern people do, but archaeological evidence suggests that personal items and familiar objects were highly valued by travelers and warriors. The few personal possessions found in Viking graves often include items that seem to have sentimental rather than practical value. The technology gap is staggering in ways you never considered. There's no way to preserve food beyond salting and smoking, no way to communicate over long distances, no way to travel faster than a horse can run or a ship can sail. The world is simultaneously huge and tiny, vast distances that take weeks to cross, but small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. Your modern medical knowledge is useless in a world where the germ theory of disease won't be discovered for another 1,000 years. You know that boiling water kills bacteria, but you can't explain why in terms that medieval people would understand or accept. You know that certain herbs have medicinal properties, but you don't know which ones or how to use them safely. Here's a detail that makes the whole situation even more depressing. You're starting to forget things about your own time. The exact layout of your apartment, the faces of people you knew, the taste of your favorite foods, all of it is becoming fuzzy around the edges, as if your brain is making room for medieval survival information by discarding modern memories. The entertainment options are limited to whatever the Vikings can create with their voices, simple instruments, and whatever stories they can remember. There are no books, no music beyond what people can perform live, no visual art beyond what can be carved or painted by hand. The intellectual stimulation you're used to simply doesn't exist in a form you can access. The weather is a constant, inescapable presence that affects every aspect of daily life. There's no central heating, no air conditioning, no way to control your environment beyond building fires and seeking shelter. You're completely at the mercy of natural forces that modern people rarely have to consider. The uncertainty about the future is perhaps the most psychologically challenging aspect of your situation. In your modern life, you had plans, goals, and a reasonable expectation that tomorrow would be similar to today. Here, survival is a daily question, and long-term planning extends about as far as the next meal or the next raid. As you sit there, homesick and miserable, you begin to understand that this isn't just about missing modern conveniences. It's about missing the entire conceptual framework that made your life comprehensible. You're not just physically displaced. You're culturally and temporally adrift in a world that operates on principles you don't understand and can't fully accept. The dawn breaks over your Viking nightmare like a medieval alarm clock that's been set to existential crisis. And as you limp back toward the longhouse, every step is a reminder of why time travel should come with a comprehensive health warning and possibly a liability waiver. Your body has become a catalog of medieval injuries and complaints that would make a modern emergency room doctor reach for the strongest painkillers available. The blisters on your hands have developed blisters of their own, creating a complex ecosystem of pain that makes holding anything more challenging than advanced calculus. Your back feels like it's been used as a Viking anvil, and muscles you didn't know existed are filing formal complaints with your nervous system. The other Vikings around you are moving with the casual efficiency of people who have done this countless times before, while you're stumbling along like a medieval zombie who's forgotten how to coordinate basic motor functions. They're already discussing the next raid, planning future adventures, and generally behaving like people who haven't just survived what feels like a medieval apocalypse. The historical reality of Viking life was that this kind of physical hardship was completely normal. These weren't extraordinary circumstances. They were Tuesday. Vikings lived with constant physical stress, regular violence, and the kind of uncertainty that would send modern people into therapy for decades. What seems like an impossible ordeal to you was just another day at the office for them. But here's what makes your situation even more humbling. You're beginning to realize that you haven't just failed at being a Viking. failed at being a functional human being in the medieval world. Every task that seemed simple in theory has proven to be impossibly complex in practice, and every skill that Vikings took for granted has revealed gaps in your abilities that you didn't know existed. The walk back to the longhouse is a parade of your own inadequacy. You're carrying less loot than anyone else, you're moving slower than the injured Vikings, and you're pretty sure that even the livestock you helped steal is judging your performance. The goat that gave you so much trouble during the raid keeps looking at you with what appears to be contempt, which is particularly demoralizing coming from an animal that's about to become someone's dinner. Your medieval clothing, which started the day as merely uncomfortable, has now achieved a level of unpleasantness that transcends normal human experience. The wool is damp with sweat and seawater. The leather has stiffened into something resembling armor made of cardboard, and everything smells like a combination of wet dog and medieval chemistry experiment gone wrong. Historians still argue whether Viking raids were primarily motivated by economic necessity or cultural tradition, but after experiencing one firsthand, you're pretty sure they were motivated by people who were tougher than you in ways that modern civilization has made impossible to replicate. These weren't just warriors. They were human beings who had adapted to a world that would kill modern people through sheer inconvenience. The longhouse appears ahead like a medieval mirage, and you realize that what seemed like primitive accommodation just days ago now looks like the height of luxury. The prospect of sleeping on straw, eating porridge, and drinking questionable water seems like paradise compared to spending another night in the open with nothing but your cloak for protection. Your fellow Vikings are already planning their next adventure, discussing potential targets and debating the merits of different raiding strategies. They're treating this entire experience like a successful business trip, while you're treating it like a natural disaster that you somehow survived through sheer luck and the patience of people who were too polite to let you die. Here's the final, crushing realization. You haven't just learned that you wouldn't survive as a Viking, learned that you probably wouldn't survive in any pre-modern society. The skills, the physical conditioning, the mental toughness, and the cultural knowledge required for medieval life are so far beyond your modern capabilities that you might as well be a different species. The social dynamics that seemed confusing at first now make perfect sense. The hierarchy, the violence, the casual acceptance of hardship, all of it is perfectly adapted to a world where survival depends on group cooperation, individual toughness, and the ability to take what you need from people who are weaker than you. It's not a moral system that modern people would accept, but it's a functional system for the world it was designed for. As you collapse onto your straw mattress, surrounded by Vikings who are already planning tomorrow's activities, you realize that this experience has been less about historical education and more about discovering the vast gulf between modern comfort and medieval reality. You haven't just visited the past, been humbled by it in ways that will probably require years of therapy to fully process. The sounds of the longhouse settling into evening routine, conversations in Old Norse, the crackling of the fire, the rustling of straw as people find their sleeping spots, create a medieval lullaby that's both foreign and oddly comforting. You're still an outsider, still completely out of your element, but you're alive. And in the medieval world, that's actually quite an achievement. Your last conscious thought before exhaustion finally claims you as a profound appreciation for every modern convenience you've ever taken for granted, and a deep, abiding respect for anyone who managed to survive even a single day in the medieval world. You wouldn't survive as a Viking, but more importantly, you've learned that survival itself was an art form that modern people have forgotten how to practice. The longhouse grows quiet around you, and the dying embers of the fire cast gentle shadows on the wooden walls. Your breathing slows, matching the rhythm of the sea outside, and for the first time in what feels like forever, you allow yourself to simply rest. The straw beneath you, which once felt like torture, now cradles your exhausted body like the softest mattress. The sounds of your fellow Vikings settling into sleep become a comforting symphony of snores and shifting fabric. In this moment of peace, you realize that while you may not have conquered the Viking world, you've survived it. You've walked in the footsteps of warriors, sailed the North Sea, and experienced a way of life that shaped the course of history. The blisters will heal, the memories will soften, and someday this will all seem like the most vivid dream you've ever had. The medieval world fades around you like morning mist, and you drift into the kind of deep, dreamless sleep that only comes after true exhaustion. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but tonight, you rest with the knowledge that you've touched something ancient and powerful,